So welcome everybody to our webinar number 7 of the Socio-Ecological Land Systems of Latin American Working Group of the Global Land Use, the Global Land Program. So thank you for attending. And our webinar today is about the role of land system in IPBES. Our group is an interdisciplinary team of researchers, and to integrate their expertise and territorial knowledge into understanding the interwebnet relations between land use patterns and their associated socio-ecological systems and vice versa in Latin America. Currently, we are 69 members and 5 coordinator members. So we have here in our webinar today, Maria. Lucia, she couldn't attend today. We also have Carlo, Diego, and myself, Elizabeth. And just before starting with the webinar itself, we want to give some announcements. So probably all of you know already about the conference that we will be in Oaxaca, Mexico this year. So there, just to remind you that we will have a session for presentations for research called Mapping Socio-Ecological Land Systems in Latin America. And also we will have a press session to discuss and exchange ideas. So it was an email sent by the GLP organization. So you can share with us your ideas by 30 September, and then we can discuss them during the Monday of the webinar. If you are not yet part of our group, so we invite you to join GLP and then also join our group. So you have to fill the instructions in the website for that. So now we are partially going to talk about IPBES. IPBES is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It is an independent intergovernmental body that was established between states to strengthen the science policy interface for biodiversity, ecosystem services, for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, also for long-term of human well-being and sustainable development. It was established in 2012 and by 94 governments. And currently in the Latin American and the Caribbean regions, there are 26 state members and 7 observer states. So the IPBES has developed several assessments. So here are some of those that our speakers today are going to cover. So we have the global assessment or the biodiversity assessment, the diverse values of and valuation of nature, and the regional assessments for the Americas. Also, we will be slightly covering about nexus assessments, but it's not possible to talk too much because it's still confidential. It will be approved or discussed in December this year in Namibia. So yeah, there is not too much that can be shared about that, but just maybe some contents and overview. So this is our agenda today. We will start with the presentation of Maria Balvanera, and then we will follow with a quick and direct questions and answers. And then our second speaker, Lucas Enrico, we will present his topic, again, another round of quick questions and answers. And then we will have a general discussion about both presentations and talk about later future collaboration together and next steps. So this was from our side, my introduction. So we will start with Patricia. So if you can start sharing your slides, I will introduce Patricia. So Patricia is a biologist graduated from the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Iztapalapa with a master's degree in biological science and a PhD in ecology from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She is currently a researcher at the Institute of Ecosystems and Sustainability Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Her studies have been focused on the relationship between society and nature, patterns of change in nature, the role of economic, social, political, and cultural factors in the current environmental crisis, the values of nature, and the development of tools to monitor changes in the interactions between nature and society to guide decisions making from global to local scales. She has also coordinated several national and global initiatives such as the Mexican Network of Socio-Ecological Systems and Sustainability, the research program from Ecosystem Change and Society, and the Global Earth Observations Biodiversity Observations Network Ecosystem Service Group. Within IPBES, she has played different roles, a coordinated lead author of the Values Guide and the Global Assessment. She was also a reviewer, editor of the Americas Assessment, and a co-chair in the Values Assessment. And she is currently editor-in-chief of the Journal of Ecology and Society, the leading online journal on socio-ecological systems and resilience. So welcome, Patricia, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here. So I would like to talk to you about how IPBES has been addressing inequities in the distribution of gains and burdens from nature loss in the context of neo-extractivism. So considering these colonial relations, extractive relationships from the tropics to the main cities, and today these patterns are still occurring and driving a lot of the land use change, and particularly picked up in the last 20 years. So I will walk you through the different assessments to highlight how these issues were addressed. So during the America's assessment, I was only involved partially as a review editor of one of the chapters. But very interestingly, in the drivers chapter, in the indirect drivers, there was a reflection of what was the role of this extractivism, and neo-extractivism, as I say, is like a bit from the 2000 years onward. And so we can see that since the 70s, of course, with on one hand, this dominating narrative that countries need to develop, and that development is basically fostering this GDP and growth. This growth was very heavily supported by extracting resources from nature and exporting them to richer countries, more affluent countries where they were consumed. After the 2000s, there's a new neo-extractivism that really escalates as there's much more demand on one side. On the other, there are important opportunities for profit in these areas, and this really has a strong impact in the region. And so we can see that for the different economies, in particular in overall, there's a 5% of contribution to the world's exports, and also an important contribution to GDP, in particularly in Mesoamerica, very important for GDP, and North America in terms of the exports. And basically, so the idea is that these Americas with a very particular outstanding biological and cultural diversity are industrializing some of them, their economies, but really a lot is based in these commodities. And then this leads to different options for economic growth, but many of them are still based in extraction for nature, which can really has negative consequences in resilience and huge social inequalities. In the land degradation, one figure was particularly polemic in the negotiations at the plenary, which is this figure in which the degradation in the global south is connected very concretely to those who consume those products from the south. So we can see how products from the Amazon and further south in Latin America, the #1 consumer is United States, followed by Japan that consumes basically products from Southeast Asia, and then many countries in Europe that consume products from Africa and Southeast Asia. Then in the global assessment, we analyze both the direct and indirect drivers of change. And of course, in many of the policies and the assessment, there's a lot of emphasis on the role of these different drivers. And of course, land use change is a major driver in terrestrial system, direct exploitation in marine ones. But in exploring the indirect drivers, we assessed some indicators that were available from 1970 to 2020 and divided the countries in high income in blue, orange middle income, in where we find most of the economies in Latin America, like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, low income countries, and the world, no? And what we see is that, of course, the high income countries have increased much more their GDP than the middle and the low income countries. That consumption per capita is much higher, although there's a very important trend, especially driven by Europe, to reduce a bit of this per capita consumption, being the lowest in the low-income countries, but with an interesting peak, which is exactly this increasing affluence due to increased GDP. And to support these changes in the economy, we found a really interesting database from Vienna, where they measure the amount of living, well, of different types of biomass, and we selected only living biomass because it's about biodiversity, right? And we see that overall, these dotted are the average. There's a fourfold increase in the demand from nature, but we can see that it's basically these middle-income countries, in the case of the Americas, again, the countries I mentioned, that where there's most of the extraction, where we see these very rapid trends in land use change driven by this really escalating demand. On the other hand, there are efforts to protect biodiversity, but also very unequal. We see that in high-income countries, there are a much larger percentage of key biodiversity areas are protected. Then there's a lot of funds from Europe and the United States to support conservation in the poorest countries, and we see that protection in middle-income countries is increasing, although the lowest. And if we see in terms of the negative impacts, we see, of course, we all know that the dirtiest parts of the processes occur in the poorest countries, but and much less in the high-income countries. And this is in terms of air pollution. We had also indicators of water pollution, nitrogen in water that's, of course, very high in these countries that are exporting agricultural goods. And also here, what we compared here in the x-axis in logarithmic scales and the y-axis, in x-axis GDP logarithmic scales and the y-axis, we have changes in biodiversity index. And we see that high-income countries actually see a positive change in their biodiversity index because they're able to import the products to feed their demand, while the poorest countries not only have a very low increase in GDP, but have the highest degradation in their biodiversity index. Of course, we discussed the role of indigenous and local people who are very prominent across Latin America in terms of their role in conserving a large fraction of the land, especially the highly conserved ecosystems and the protected areas. And as you all know, well, the key message emerging from this was the need for transformative change and multi-actor decisions. And there's a whole assessment that will soon be released also on this. Then for the values assessment, our main message is that the way nature is valued in political and economic decisions is both a key driver of the global biodiversity crisis, but also a key vital opportunity to address it. And we know that over millennia, people around the world have developed many different ways to connect with nature, to conceptualize it, and to identify the benefits or contributions for nature. But despite this diversity, economic and political decisions, and by economic we understand a transaction between private actors and political, those that refer to the common good or bad, have tended to prioritize a narrow set of values. Basically, market-based instrumental values have been prioritized at the expense of relation and intrinsic values, and then many of the conservation policies actually have downplayed the values of local communities to prioritize intrinsic values. These biases are not really dependent on the lack of methods, because we found a huge amount of methods to assess, but there also indigenous communities have been assessing nature and have their own methods that are very rarely recognized. It's really the institutions, all the formal and informal arrangements between people that are underpinned by and support certain values that play a key role in these decisions. And I won't go into this typology, it's going to take us, but we further explore the role of different types of power in making these decisions. And so the way we see the world, the discursive power, has a huge impact in the kind of values, the societal principles that are promoted, which in turn affect the structural power, who has the decision and how decisions are made, and so which specific values are taken into account, and then this trickles again back. And for instance, just quickly, this is, we have the fortress conservation approach that is very prominent in Africa and in some cases of in Latin America, but not so common, where there's a top-down idea of nature to be conserved in and by of itself, while an inclusive area protection approach that is really inclusive of the local values is much more common in Latin America. And I will not go through this animation, sorry about that. And so with this, in the values assessment, we propose 4 values-centered leverage points to address these, which need to be activated simultaneously. Some are a bit more shallow, so a bit easier to to operate so much deeper, so will take much more time, but have a much more profound effect, which are about undertaking valuation to recognize all this huge diversity of values, embedding valuation into decision-making, reforming policies and institutions so they can embrace this diversity of values, and also to shift societal goals and norms, to move away from this obsession with GDP to think about sustainability-aligned values, which we found have to do a lot with the common good, with balancing short and long term, with balancing individual and collective gains, material and non-material gains, and really about fostering relationships between people and nature that are based on reciprocity and responsibility. And I will not go through this animation. And so in synthesis, I would like to close with the fact that Latin America hosts a very unique fraction of the world's biodiversity, which is very rapidly disappearing. And one of the major drivers is this key message that these countries need to increase their GDP by transforming their nature, by commodifying nature and the people who live in these territories to support this growth. With this, I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia, for your really comprehensive presentation about equity. So we will open the floor for questions, direct questions with direct answers. You can also type these questions in the chat or directly open your microphone. Any question? Yeah,
Alejandrina Viesca has a question.
Cannot hear you.
Hi, yes, thank you. Hi, Patricia, thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm wondering if I can ask you, you know, the relationship between extractivism and economy with the use of nature and how it transforms the relationship. I wonder what's your stake? What do you think about how deep this transformation goes? I mean, if this actually influences the way the values of nature are built, you know, like how deep this instrumentalization of nature goes beyond just the economy, beyond just the behavior, you know, if this goes deep into the roots of people, into the conscience, you know, I'm just wondering, what do you think about this?
So I can only speak from Mexico, from my direct experience talking to people. I think, and it's a bit what I try to explain, it certainly went too fast probably. I think that this dominant narrative has really influenced people everywhere, no? So it's a dominant narrative that it's all the time there, that is influencing these values, and much more than that, the relative importance of different values. And yet, when you take the time to talk to people in rural areas, which is my experience, of course, not in cities, but in rural areas, I still feel most of the time there's a longing for the recognition of these much deeper held values. So yes, the commodification is very strong. Even all those payments for ecosystem services also influence this commodification. But even, for instance, in the Lacanau forest, where people established there only 40 years ago, and who have very diverse background on they, by the day-to-day experience of being in nature really is reflected in the way they talk about nature, they connect to nature. So I think the impact of these narratives is basically in the design and policy, and certainly in the minds of people living in the city and the big investors, the agribusinesses and so on. But I would argue that in the minds of many of the people living in the rural settings who have been totally displaced and totally ignored by these policies, they really do not share these. And even the youth, they are searching for other models to think about their link with nature beyond what they hear in the social media.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. And now a second question, and next we will move to Lucas' presentation. So, Lily.
Hola,
Lili, qué gusto.
Patty. Very nice to hear you. And you know, we are preparing for COP 16. And my question is, do we have any good example on how to use these different values and how to change what can we take to the COP, like to say, look, we have to do this if we really want to achieve something by 2030? That's my question.
Well, I think the values assessment has had a huge impact in both like in the Kunming-Montreal framework, and we've been working a lot with the indigenous groups, no, that are diverse in terms of the recognition of their importance, of their values, and their role in stewardship. In terms of success stories of changing these values, I think what we have for now is this figure I showed you, which is this idea of the leverage points, no? And so how to do valuation, we have a step-by-step guide, how to embed it, what kinds of institutions, basically examples such as these community-based institutions. There are several examples in chapter 6, for instance, where there have been negotiations between different actors to reach a consensus and for sustainability aligned values and changing the paradigms, maybe that's less. So I would say you can go to chapter 6 and there's several boxes in which there are very concrete examples from Japan, from different territories, which I cannot remember right now. Of course, all this discussion about the role of buen vivir and all the analogues in different continents. So I think the boxes in chapter 6 would be a very good starting point.
Thanks,
Patricia. And now, we have another question. So we will see this really quick. Then Eugenio, please.
Hello, thank you, Patricia, for the presentation. I was a bit surprised by your presentation and the report with the omission of the role of China, particularly with respect to South America. China is the largest trader for Brazil. It's a big investor in Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, several countries that exploit commodities. So China today is the largest importer of beef and soybeans from Brazil, not the United States or Europe. So what is your take or of the committee on the role of China in that?
Okay, so let me explain. The IPBES is an intergovernmental platform, and the products by the IPBES, and especially the summary for policymakers, is negotiated word by word, chapter, paragraph by paragraph. And so we really cannot do a country by country analysis of the role played by these different countries, because immediately we would get a backlash from these countries and they will stop, they will sabotage the whole assessment. So I fully agree with you that China plays a key role, but IPBES needs to be extremely careful in how to frame these messages and cannot highlight these individual roles.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patricia, again for your presentations and all your answers. And now we will start with Lucas' presentation. So please, Lucas, if you can share your screen, I will introduce.
Okay.
So Lucas is a biologist and has a PhD in biology. Currently, he's a researcher at the National Scientific and Technological Research Council and a professor at the National University of Córdoba, Argentina. His research focuses on the relationship between functional biodiversity of plant communities and the provision of ecosystem services under different land use scenarios, as well as on other projects in ecological and socio-ecological fields. He worked in the analysis of communities and ecosystems by describing their taxonomy and functional diversity, baselines and monitoring, patterns of regeneration and resilience, as well as the response to disturbances in natural and anthropic ecosystems at local, regional, and global scales. He participates in scientific initiatives such as the National Commission of Biological Diversity and the Ecological Association of Argentina. At international level, he participated in the Eco-Services project of Future Earth, an organization of which he has his governing council member as representative of low middle income countries. He also participates in ecological global research networks such as AirDeepNet and DarkDeepNet. And within IPBES, he has been lead author of the IPBES Nexus assessment. So please, Lucas, can you start your presentation?
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to be part of this webinar. It's a great pleasure for me. When we were invited to this webinar, we were asked to try to tackle these three big questions about the relationship between terrestrial socio-ecological systems of Latin America and the IPBES assessment. I hope we can discuss a lot about these questions. I try to focus particularly on the first one, since I think the second and the third ones are more suitable for discussion. So, as you probably know, and was already mentioned here, IPBES assessments are a bunch of almost 10 assessments already released and approved. And there are two other assessments coming soon by the end of the year, the Nexus assessment and the Transformative Change assessment, plus others that are being developing now. I try to focus particularly in those that Patty didn't mention in her presentation. And I just try to look for dimensions of Latin American countries at every of the three assessments I work on, which are the scenarios and models assessment, the pollination assessment and the invasive species assessment. And just for you to understand how I did this, I just look for references for every single country along the assessments. This is a subjective, of course, interpretation of the results. The classification is subjective, but I basically try to divide them dimensions in positive or neutral or negative in terms of what these mentions refers to a variable or the biodiversity itself or ecosystem service that is being assessed along the assessment in terms of the implicances for each of these variables. So I run a search in each assessment and obtain this kind of table with different numbers for mentions to the different countries, either positive, neutral, or negative. The first point that arises is that, well, a positive point for me is that Latin America and the Caribbean are well represented along the three assessments. This is in comparison to other countries of the world or other regions. I think that the relative weight of Latin America is high. Of course, there is a variety of examples and that's why I decide to talk about the salsa, the tango, and the rock in this presentation. Salsa being that representation for the funny things or the good things that are most of the times the image that the world has of Latin America. Coming from Argentina, of course, has to mention tango, which is recognized as a sad kind of music, in fact. So I try to make a parallelism between the good examples coming from Latin America with the salsa and the sad or the bad examples coming from the tango. And of course, the rock is that kind of thing that is a mixture of feelings and rhythm. And that could include the happy way of thinking or the funny things, but also the sad part of the music. So if you analyze the positive things and we go to the scenarios and model assessments of IPBES, we can see a prevalence of positive examples coming from Latin America. And most of the time, the positive examples, not only for this assessment, but also for the other two, comes from this relationship between indigenous people or local knowledge and the management of natural resources or the uses of nature benefits for people. One of the iconic examples mentioned, the scenarios and models, are the National Program of Conservation and Sustainable Utilization of Caiman in Bolivia, which incorporates indigenous knowledge on the decision making about the use of the caiman. If you go to the thematic assessment on the invasive alien species, well, of course, when we talk about invasive species, most of the studies or the effects of invasive species are negative at the scale of the whole world. And this is reflected also for Latin America, with 92 studies from different countries showing negative effects of invasive alien species. But also there are some positive examples, particularly again related to management of species or policies that includes local people on their management, or social science, which is designed to study the effects of invasive alien species. Also, in relation to the first point that Latin America and the Caribbean is good represented, just as an example of the assessment on pollinators, pollination and food production, 17 examples out of 26 in the assessment included at least one Latin America country. Most of the examples are comparative studies between different regions of the world, but it's very important for me that more than half of them include a Latin American country. And again, the positive part of this is the use of nature by people, and how the local knowledge is incorporated in policies and strategies for managing the pollinator crisis is included in different countries, ranging from Brazil to Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and also in Argentina. Of course, there's also the tango sides of the pollinators and Latin America in terms of the crisis of pollinators. The invasion of European bumblebee in South America, Chile and Argentina particularly, or the use of pesticides in Brazil related to food production, which is related to the decrease in pollinators' abundance and richness, is there. Brazil being one of the more paradigmatic examples, but also having Argentina as one of the countries in the world with the highest use of agrochemicals for soy production, particularly. Also, the sad part of the Latin America participation in the invasive alien species, an assessment released in 2023, one of the more new assessment from IPBES, is that the Americas are taking the leading on the invasive alien species numbers during the last years, while other regions of the world managed to decrease the curve or the growth of the tendencies through higher numbers of invasive alien species. America as a whole, there's not a discrimination here between Latin America and North America, but we know for the same assessment that the invasive alien species are becoming more and more important in South America and Central America now than in the past, where it was a more important problem for North America. So, well, the sad part of this is that we are leading as a continent the number of invasive alien species we have. And this is a problem for the future, of course, of the region. And going to the rock part of the participation of Latin America in the assessment, particularly when we analyze the scenarios and models assessment, we see that at this image, which represents the availability of data for biodiversity at the global scale, we see that there is a mixture of situations in Latin America, with parts of Latin America, particularly the more tropical regions of our big continent, having the best databases or the best information on biodiversity, but most of other regions having very, very low diversity data. At this image, the red represents the higher number or the best records for biodiversity, and the white color represents the worst availability of data for biodiversity. Also, we have this kind of different situations with some regions better represented than other. For the case of the service on invasive species in mountain ecosystem or mountain regions, we have a representation of Argentina and Chile particularly, but a lot of regions of South America and Central America that are not well represented in that. So there's a work to do there. Also, in the effects of biological invasions in the economic cost for each country, we see that some of the most affected countries are part of Latin America, like Brazil, Colombia, or Argentina here. So this is part of the problem that would or are supposed to increase following the tendencies I show in the previous slides. Also, considering Latin America, we have with respect or in relation to Latin America, diversity of realities or situations. And this case of the Mercosur and the strategies, regional strategies for dealing with the problem of invasive alien species show a great diversity or difference between the countries that are part of Mercosur. Since Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Venezuela have very different laws and policies for dealing with invasive alien species. So there is a great mixture that makes very difficult to control invasive alien species in a region that is highly related through trade of commodities and other products. And for the end of my presentation, as was mentioned, we cannot talk about the upcoming assessments, but for the Nexus, particularly, which is the assessment in which I'm involved and I'm part of the authors, I would like to say that this is a very strategic assessment in terms of the relationship that were mentioned by Patty between regions of the world. The Nexus assessment is focused on the relationships between biodiversity, water, food production, health, and well, for those who are familiar with the Nexus concept, there's also energy as an important part of the relationship between different variables and elements of the Nexus relationships. For the IPBES assessment, energy was put out of the group of variables or elements we are analyzing. But of course, energy is a key point to be considered for the future, because it's related to food production, to health, to water use, and to biodiversity in different ways, particularly if you talk about biofuels or electric mobility in relation to Latin America country and the role that we play as producers of commodities. There's also interesting in the Nexus assessment to take a look on the definitions of food and what food means for different cultures and countries. From the point of view of the health and the concept of One Health, the Latin America countries play a key role also, since most of the territory are tropical or subtropical areas, which have a high incidence of zoonotic diseases and relationship between habitat fragmentation, land use change, and spillover of different diseases from wild animals to domestic animals or to people. And also being Latin America, a region where water is a very critical element, since we are most of the region is arid or semi-arid region. You will see that water is a very important topic in the relationship between the Nexus for Latin America and the Caribbean regions. And in relation to this point that was mentioned in the question recently, I particularly tried to include in the assessment the concept of teleconnections and telecoupling, because I think it's very important to highlight these relationships and the consequences of certain choices made at one part of the world for the natural resources of others, not only nature, but also social well-being. And for the last, I would like to highlight the participation of what we call the Patria Grande in Spanish, which is a big homeland, in IPBES assessment. And I encourage you to participate in the different calling for participation as experts, if you are a researcher belonging to one of the Latin American countries. Because I think that there's a direct relationship between these examples and how we put our reality in the context of this global assessment, which is not the same if we are part or we are not part of them as an author or co-authors. This will not be mentioned in the assessment, so that's why I put these images here. But one of the examples that are important, considering this problem of the telecoupling, is the energy transition that most developed countries are making, and what consequences have this for the regions of the region of Latin America, particularly the electric mobility that is meant to solve the problem of the energy transition in developed countries, are affecting and will affect strongly the region that we call the lithium triangle, including Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, for the wetlands of the highlands in the Andes. And that's all for me. And this is a good picture from Joaquin Torres Garcia that I love it so much, and I like to to show every time I can, because it represents our north. He says that our north is the south, and I strongly believe in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for your interesting combination of salsa, tango, and rock in your analysis of the IPBES assessment. So yeah, we are within the 60 minutes that we planned for the webinar, but of course we will continue with the discussion. So those who are interested in staying in the discussion, we will stay up for 20 more minutes. Yeah, so we open the floor also for questions from the audience, if there are any. If not, I can start with a question. So you said, Lucas, that the sector in the Nexus assessment, the sectors of energy and transport were not considered. And I'm also surprised that usually the forestry sector is not considered in general in Nexus assessment. So will you, considering the review that you did across the different Nexus assessments, do you think that the forestry sector will add some useful information to the analysis, or it's really already incorporated in the other Nexus elements?
Well, I didn't think on the forestry sector, to be honest, but I think is directly related in the land use change and the biodiversity loss at the analysis. Also is mentioned the forestry sector is mentioned. I can say a lot of that, as you know, but in the demand for water use and how the forestry sector is changing the hydrological dynamics of ecosystems, and then the availability of water for human use or the hydrological cycle in general in the atmosphere. So it's not an element by itself, but is included in the analysis in different ways. Yes.
Thank you.
Also, sorry, the forestry sector is also mentioned and previous assessments, particularly in relations to the loss of pollinators, for example. I see lots of examples on that.
Okay, thanks. Some more questions from the audience? Maria.
We have a question also to Lucas. Well, thanks to two of you very much for your presentations. I'm very curious to see when the Nexus assessment comes out. I think they're discovering fascinating topics. And I see interesting interrelationships with the topics themselves. And I was wondering, are these topics that you presented also assessed interrelationally? Or more, I mean, they are very interesting relationships, for example, between the energy transition and the food production or the food definition, and how both can be affected. I was mainly curious. Yeah.
The Nexus relationships can be done in different ways. We can choose by pairs of elements and analyze the relationship between a pair of elements. But the idea is particularly to start thinking in a more integrated way, relationing all the different elements in the policy design and the use of nature, since the logic along the history has been that one of the siloed approach. Say, for example, I want to maximize the production of food, then I go for doing that and just do whatever I need to get that objective. And then we are saying, and probably it's the consequences of the finding of other assessments that the Nexus assessment comes through, that we cannot keep going in the same way of thinking, of this siloed thinking. So if you want to maximize the production of food, you have to be conscious of the effects that this activity has on water availability, on biodiversity, on health, because this is a high relationship between the change on land cover for food production, for example, and the effects on health, and as I mentioned, with the recent pandemics, and that lots of examples have arisen from this kind of relationships. So the idea is to do these integrations the higher possible, linking as many elements as possible to the site. And at this point, it's important to start thinking on governance also as a integrated way of decision making, where the economic ministry works with the agriculture minister and the health minister to design public policies, for example.
Yeah, thanks. Also thinking on potential synergies, right? So everything comes together there, no?
Yeah, synergies and trade-offs. Yeah. That's the idea.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Lucas. So still waiting for more discussion points or questions for both of our speakers. So if someone else wants to raise any subject.
I could have something else on thinking on what you just said, bringing up the question of governance. The two of you did not mention it, but of course it's embedded within the requirements or what the potential application of the results from the different assessments. But I don't know, maybe would you like to expand a bit on the role governance has played, or the role that IPBES is playing for governance?
Yes, I would like to start. We did explore very much like the role of these institutions, right? Which are all these formal and informal arrangements that, of course, determine governance. And also, as I showed, we explore the different power relations among these actors. So basically, the key message, and that I think is very, very strong for Latin America, is that all across the continent, we have so many environmental conflicts, no? And we have the death of all these environmental activists because their voices are not heard, because their values are not considered, and because they are facing very unequal power relations where they are expelled from their territories, they are dispossessed from their lands, from water they had access to. And this really is about governance that we know certainly in other regions, but I know for sure in Latin America, the governance, the role of governments in supporting the public good and investing in this public good and addressing these inequalities has decreased very much since the 70s. And so I think the consequences of all these you see all across Latin America, no? The conflicts, the wars, the migration, and I think what IPBES is sending a very strong message on the importance to have a much more inclusive governance process in which different actors are called to the table, in which through either very formal evaluation processes or other types of negotiations, these different values are put on the table and they are included in decisions. So the impact of for example, the values assessment on these governance arrangements is low, but is quite strong. The day after the approval of the Summary for Policymakers of Values, both the UK and the United States published statements saying they would recognize the values of people in indigenous lands and so on. In the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, definitely the words of diverse values, inclusive decision-making made it there very, very clearly. And there have been several efforts, for instance, with the Asian Development Bank, who was very, very interested in knowing how these would be operationalized. This, of course, in the case of Latin America, has very strong impacts in the Escazú agreement that we have also been collaborating. Very recently, in preparation for the COP, we have been approached by a platform working with businesses that is very interested in delivering this message to the small and big businesses they work with. And we prepared a short contribution to their newsletter and so on. And so the impacts, I think, so if we think, for instance, the IPCC was created in 1982, of course, today, everybody knows what is IPCC, what is at stake, and so on. Of course, IPBES was only created in 2012. And all these results are gradually taken up by different governments. In particular, France has been very vocal in including some of these agreements. And it's a slow process, but there's definitely been impact. And on the other hand, what I see very clearly is that organized resistance by indigenous people, by NGOs, by activists, do rely on these documents to show this has been agreed, this has already been signed by your country. Of course, none of these IPBES documents, which is different in the CBD, are, are binding. They do not need to agree on doing because there's no prescriptive, this will be done. It's rather you do A or B and these are the consequences. But definitely it's a tool. They've definitely been very, very widely used, these documents, in different kinds of resistant processes.
Thanks. I don't know, Lucas, if you want to add there.
Yeah, just I fully agree with Patty, but I would like to add that, of course, it depends on the waves we have, you know, in Latin America particularly, but also in the entire world currently, about different governments and ideologies that change a lot from, we can say, from the left to the right, but it's not necessarily like that, because sometimes neo-extractivism, for example, is independent of the ideology of the right and the left. You know, as Maristeles Vampa clearly note, for Latin America, different governments took the same strategy around the extractivism and the use of natural resources, the exploitation of natural resources. And thinking in the Argentinian case, now we having a president that denies the climate change, and that is very hard for me to imagine how these instruments could be considered by the government. But of course, it's a strong tool for people, for NGOs, and for civil society to record the governments to honor the treaties that they sign, either they or the previous governments, you know. It's complicated at some point, but I agree with Patty that it's a very important tool, particularly for the minorities.
That's very nice to hear. No, definitely. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia and Lucas. I also have a question regarding this space for voices of different actors. So I was wondering how IPBES is in fact considering the voice of non-human animals and of nature, particularly, for example, from the perspective of South America, considering, for example, that in some countries like Ecuador or Bolivia, nature have legal rights. So yeah, it is really being considered there or not, or is mostly focused on human well-being or human benefits? Or because I have read several times that yeah, it is still too anthropocentric, the perspective of IPBES, and even if this talk about nature and connection between humans and nature, it's still in favor of humans, but not considering in reality the interest of the other species and other entities in the world.
Yes, I would like to answer. This is a fantastic question. So actually, during the conceptualization of the IPBES conceptual framework, these kinds of ideas were put on the table. And that's exactly why first the values guide was commissioned and then the full values assessment went on. Before the values assessment started, there was a very profound reflection on this idea about ecosystem services, no, as a service from nature, which led to the idea of contributions to people from nature, which is already going a different way, and we're thinking about much more of a reciprocal relationship. And in the values assessment, both in chapter 2 and in chapter 6, and you can see some of it in the summary for policymakers, which very strongly explore the values of not other than humans, no, and their agency and their importance. And in particular in chapter 6, there's a very interesting, so in chapter 2 is more the conceptual underpinning and how these are conceived and where they come from in different contexts. And in chapter 6, there's actually an exploration of the constitutions of different countries, some of which they are already the rights of nature in and for themselves that are being highlighted. No?
Yeah, just to add that after the values assessment, at least in the Nexus assessment, the concept of summa causae and buen vivir has a very important role along the assessment concerning the rights of nature, and the way in which we treat the health concepts includes all the nature. Is not a human health, but is including the right of nature, of course.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. So are there more questions from the audience or something else? Ale, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks. So if I could ask you, Patricia, just to deepen on your previous reply. So these contributions to nature and all the values that you state in the values assessment, it was a creation through, for, and because of IPBES. Is that right?
the concept of nature's contributions to people, yes. It was, yeah, so while we were all involved in the regional assessment and the land degradation was going on, the MAP, which is the multi-expert panel that is the scientific body of IPBES, questioned the idea of ecosystem services. So a team led by Unai Pascual and Sandra Diaz sent us an email to each and everyone involved in that moment in IPBES to assess the concept of ecosystem services and to reply. And all of us had some contribution. For example, in my case, it was not very big, so I was not invited to the team of authors, but if you see the team of authors, it's quite a big team. It's very diverse. It has many people from in sociology, anthropology, political sciences, of course, economists, who really met and analyzed all this information that all of us sent us, and they had many iterations, and they developed this concept that is way more inclusive. Probably I must say, and they know, the authors know very well, the opening paragraphs are not as constructive as could have been, and it really led to a backlash, very, very violent from the ecosystem services community. That was really very unfortunate. But I think that was just a paragraph that could have been written in a different way. But I think in general, yes, it was a really very important step forward. And so in the midst of this backlash, there was an independent team that analyzed. Actually, it was a bit later because they already had data, or maybe it was in the midst, but somehow in response to this huge tension they created, and that was created because of this backlash. There was a very interesting paper that analyzed with a very diverse team again, what each of these components, the ecosystem services and nature's contributions meant, and who would be using it. And basically, the ecosystem services component it is not exclusive, but was very much about the supply and very much about a quantitative perspective. It doesn't mean the only one. While the contributions for nature, a contribution to people from nature is a much more qualitative assessment, and also is much more about the demand. There was also a very interesting paper by a set of young researchers, many of them involved in IPBES as fellows, who actually chose this first very contentious paragraph and made a very interesting analysis of saying, okay, you have, I don't know, 6 claims. I will look for evidence of your claim. And they showed that many of these claims were a bit overstated, but there certainly were important claims about the fact that ecosystem services did not include many of the cultural, of the qualitative, of the reciprocal relationships with nature.
Wow, thank you for that explanation. You know, if I may, Liz, if I may just yes, just thank you, because I have been trying to track this idea, you know. I have been precisely studying this idea, how it came to be, and now you're just replying in 2 minutes, so that's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patricia. We have another question from Virginia.
Yes, hi, I'm Virginia Burkett, Chief Scientist for Climate and Land Use Change with the U.S. Geological Survey and a newcomer to the GLP. And I was wondering if your efforts are tied in any way, or can they be tied to a new geo work program activity called the Land Degradation Neutrality Initiative. It's being led by Germany, and it just it's GEO is 116 countries that share Earth observations. And there's GeoBond you may have heard of, and a lot of other activities that relate to biodiversity. But this LDN, Lucas mentioned the land degradation aspects, and I was just wondering if there is any integration or interest in integrating and working with the folks that are leading the LDN initiative for GEO. Is anyone familiar with that?
So I can answer the fact that there's a new assessment underway, which is about indicators of biodiversity.
Okay.
Can you hear me, or did I get frozen?
Yes.
Okay.
No, you're good.
Okay, so there's a new assessment that is coming in, and currently they are preparing what we call the scoping document, which is kind of the outline that needs to be approved by the plenary. And what is very interesting is that this scoping document within, well, this assessment within IPBES is currently being co-led, the biodiversity, thank you, biodiversity monitoring assessment is being co-led, these efforts, by Andy Gonzalez, who is also the head of GeoBond. So there's definitely, so I'm sure he is totally aware, and Andy is the head of all the GeoBond efforts globally and will also be leading this assessment. And I am so glad, because since we did the global assessment, I remember insisting on the importance to have a much clearer partnership with GeoBond, and finally we're there.
Good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So if there are not further questions, we will conclude our webinar.